Hello, and thank you very much for agreeing to sit through a video keynote. We're at my house in Pasadena, California, which means that the garbage people might come, the dogs will go crazy. When the postman comes, the dogs are gonna complain. So you're just gonna have to put up with normal urban life stuff. So thank you very much for coming to this. I want to take a little bit of time today to talk about boring history stuff, but I don't think it's actually that boring. It's pretty relevant these days, and important and relevant because of the way that the game industry has evolved over the last couple of years. And I think some of these ideas and some of the lessons that we've learned in the past and that were learned by the people who founded the games industry are super important to remember right now. As the industry evolves more, as it gets both easier to do our jobs, easier to make content, and also harder to differentiate that content and to do things that impress, our fans and consumers. Some of the things that I think about when now as an old man, I look back at the beginning of my career, seem to be important again. So I want to remind us of a little bit of that stuff, and I hope it's not too much of a nostalgia trip. And if it is, I can't see you. This is pre-recorded, so you can throw garbage at the screen or you do whatever you want to do. Yell at me. It's fine. So when I started out in the games industry, it had already been around for I would say 10 to 15 years, really, as a business. But it was very primitive. It was tens and then hundreds of people making games. And it was still the case when I joined a company called Looking Glass, which was my first games job, that you would say you were a game developer or that you made video games. And the response of people would be confusion. They didn't understand. It didn't occur to people at that point that human beings made games. It seemed like a computer thing. You have to remember that up until maybe the mid 90s, most people's experience of video games was seeing them on television or seeing an arcade game, in a market or maybe in an arcade. And lots of them were from Japan, and people had the idea, certainly in the United States, and I think in Europe to some extent as well, that games all came from Japan. And so there was a kind of a concept that video games were perhaps made by aliens in orbit, or that they were somehow automatically made by the machine. And the idea that there were human beings who had to come up with these concepts and make them, and that it was an art form in addition to being a technology, was something that was difficult to explain. And so if you were out amongst the muggles in the world, the civilians as we used to call them, trying to explain what you did for a living, you ended up taking a lot of time telling them that you needed to teach the computer to do these things, and that you needed to come up with the idea for what a game was. And it's understandable. I'm not trying to insult any of these people, but we kind of lose that context today too. I mean, if you think back, or if you think about it, the concept of like 3 lives, which seems as easy as breathing in and out to us now, that had to be invented. There's a guy called Ed Logg who was working on asteroids, which also had to be invented. And he had the idea of this game. And up until that point, games had timers. Maybe you had like 1 life or 1 character after the timer ran out. And really, a lot of video game rule sets were based on pinball and pachinko and other games that existed before. And Ed really decided that he was going to give the player 3 lives and the opportunity, by scoring high, to get maybe another life. And the game could be tuned in that way so that it was challenging but felt fair. And it was an act of intentional creation. It wasn't like archaeologists on a recent dig found the concept of 3 lives in its natural ore vein deep under the earth. A person had to invent that. A person had to invent what real-time animation was. A person had to invent what it was like to feel responsiveness with a controller. All of these things. And I'm not trying to bring this up in order to make you feel bad or to be the ranting of an old man. I'm trying to sort of begin to make a point with this, which is that at the beginning, and really still when I joined the games industry in the early 90s, the options for what we could do were very limited. And so we had to constantly think about what we could accomplish with the very limited resources that were available to us. And so it really focused the mind because we were always thinking about not running out of memory, how much CPU we had. And you could have ambitious ideas. Oh, sure, we always wanted to have 3D characters and animation that, that looked realistic. But we also had, very meager resources. And it helped us to really kind of automatically separate what was important from what wasn't as important. What would make a big difference to players from what wasn't going to make a big difference to players. And those games, if you go look back on them, and when I look at old reviews, when I do a thing that hopefully you will do in your career in a couple of decades, and look back at reviews of early games that I had made, written by modern reviewers, as a kind of a retro review. The thing that they always say about these early games, and especially about the arcade games, which had come about 5 to 10 years before when I started, is that they're so efficient. They're so well refined, like poetry. And modern reviewers have a great deal of respect for this. And I think it's difficult for them to see that a lot of that, it was genius of the people who made those games, because making games at the time with no tools, no history, and social pressure against you. Everyone you met when you were a game designer at that time would tell you to go get a real job. So there's a lot of really negative social pressure at that time. But these people were really, really smart and really resilient and had to really think very hard about everything that they did. Every decision to do something meant writing a new tool and then educating somebody else how to use that tool, or building something yourself from scratch. Oh, I want to have some sound. Okay, I should go figure out how to do sound. It wasn't like you get an example off GitHub or buy a sound library. It didn't exist. The idea would occur to you and then you try it out. There wasn't a book you'd go look at. The books were written when people analyzed these games. And it focused the mind. So you didn't have a choice to really think about what was important or what wasn't. And so when I read these reviews and they talk about how beautifully focused these games are, I think it's a great compliment to the guys who designed those games and to us where we design games. But it also wasn't something that we had really a choice about. Now we have a choice. We have a choice to decide what's important in gameplay, what's important in a visual style. We have a choice to decide to mix elements of gameplay and audio, input, VR, AR, all these things. And because we have so much choice, it can be very difficult to find your voice. It can be very difficult to find something that is the edge in your game. And this has caused there to be a real shift, to be honest, in the focus of game development from when I started out and now. At conferences like this, when I was starting out, there was a kind of panic. We would go to forums, we would give talks to one another about, oh my God, how to draw something in 3D, or how to make animation go fast enough on a screen, how to get a frame rate when you're drawing 2D sprites, how to do sprite manipulation, how to have sound and video at the same time without causing a computer to go to a crawl. And it was kind of this kind of shared support. It was almost like we were under attack by physics, under attack by limited computing power, and together, if we banded together and shared enough information, we could defeat this problem and have our games actually get playable. And that focus has now shifted as I look at, for instance, the curriculum for the Game Developers Conference in California that's going on right now. I see that the priority has obviously shifted as the industry has matured to a focus on achieving, a real kind of knife edge focus, a real knife edge perspective on what it is you're trying to accomplish in a game, because the opportunities to make games about more things is much greater. And I think that it's helpful to kind of try to put yourself back into the footsteps or a setting where you might have super limited resources. And by that I mean that I think that as we look at the incredible panoply of tools and stuff available to us as game developers today, one way maybe, and this is just an experimental thought of mine, which you're having to sit through, to help to focus the mind, is to put yourself back in 1995. Imagine that you're using a very weak computer and you don't have any tools. that you're going to have to write your own plugin for 3D Studio to import models, and that maybe you should have a 2D game or an isometric game. How does your idea stand out then? Like, what's important about your idea? If you really had to spend 6 months writing your own renderer, would it be worth it? Is the thing you're drawing worth that kind of effort? That's the kind of decision-making process that really helped to hone what we were trying to accomplish when we were making games at Looking Glass. We were doing some of the very first 3D games with physics systems. Because we couldn't do anything, we had to make sure that every single thing our systems did, really, really counted. And it was a very helpful discipline. It's a very hopeful time as well. So I think part of the reason that we see studios today choose a retro style for games is obviously nostalgia, and because pixelated stuff and low poly stuff is a really cool design decision. But it also helps to really focus on gameplay, helps to focus on simple mechanics, helps to focus you on what's important. And really the genesis of the idea for the talk I'm giving you right now, unfortunately for you, was thinking about whether or not those ideas, those design decisions that you're forced to make when you try to make a retro style game and try to replicate that resource scarce design aesthetic that we had to have, could be applied to big AAA games. It could be applied to games that use a lot of technology. And I'll give you a couple of examples of places where this made a big difference that might be so old that nobody talks about them anymore. There's a great game by Peter Molyneux called Dungeon Keeper, and at the time that it was being made, I think it was around 1999 or 2000, it was a very big technological showcase. I mean, Peter always wants to have a really good rendering team. He wants to, draw things that are really surprising. The idea for this game was that you're the operator of the dungeon, and the enemy is the explorers who come in and try to grab your loot. And it's a cool concept. They had some really cool characters. They had really good animation. But the game just wasn't working because they were really focused on the look. They were really focused on being able to draw the dungeon. They were focusing on how the characters behaved, writing AI for the party that would come in, and just generally trying to figure out what it meant to turn the concept of like Dungeons and Dragons on its head. Now you're the dungeon, right? And it wasn't fun. It wasn't fun. And it wasn't fun in a way that's really analogous to the way a lot of sort of mid-development games today are not fun. And there's a kind of a panic in the team, where everybody knows that the game isn't fun and nobody's playing it, when they're not working because they enjoy it. The play testers aren't doing that thing you need to see them do, which is, stay after their shift to play the game and to learn more. That lets you know that it's really fun. So there's a panic, and maybe nobody is going to say that there's a problem. And this is another, management issue on teams that I don't want to go into here. But if you're in that kind of a state, you know what I mean. If you've ever been in that kind of a state, it's a real panic where you realize that maybe the cool mechanic, the elevator pitch that you had for the game, or the way you've implemented the game has stuck you in what feels like a concrete corner. You're not going to get out of it because it's not fun. What are we going to do? Well, Peter was stuck in this corner. And what he did was he went home over the weekend and he wrote an ASCII text version of the Dungeon Master game in 2D with little asterisks and minus signs and X's marching around a dungeon drawn in ASCII, and played with it until it was fun. And when it was fun, and it didn't take long because he's a good game designer, and he had programmers, from his company at the time there with him at his house. I'm sure nobody was sober. And it was like a game jam. And it really is kind of also predated when game jams became popular. But it was a focused game jam on just this concept. Because they knew that it would be fun to operate the dungeon and put traps, for a party trying to get in and kill the little bastards. But it wasn't working out at the studio. And they made it fun in ASCII. And they developed new ideas about gameplay in the ASCII. And it refined the concepts that they wanted to get to because they were able to see what the game actually was, absent all of the stuff around it. And at that time, making that 3D, making the sound and everything that went into the quality, the sort of leading edge quality of what was at that time 3D gaming, was a huge distraction against that. And it's a little different today. Now that huge distraction comes because there's so many opportunities. You can make all sorts of things and imagine different worlds and use rendering techniques, and Unity and Unreal have so many ways to spend time making stuff look just so, or do transparency, or this kind of lighting effect with this kind of physics model, and blah, blah, blah. So you can easily lose track of whether or not the game is fun, the mechanics actually working. And they were in that boat, and they got their way out of it by going back to very simple terms. And Peter, when I talked to him about it, he said it felt like being back in his bedroom when he was a teenager, writing games for Sinclair, like for a ZX80, which is a very simple computer, which could do almost nothing. And so even writing an ASCII game on a ZX80 was a real challenge, and you had to be a very good programmer to do it. And so that discipline saved that game. And I don't recall if it was a success or if it made a lot of money or anything, but the story itself of going back to the basics is really important. And I think it's possibly more important now than it's ever been. I think it's important that we just take a minute and remember that the reason games are, in my view, very superior to every other form of entertainment is because it's a story we tell ourselves. It's interactive. You are the protagonist of the game, or you and your friends. You have a shared experience, or an experience in which you surprise yourself with your own abilities. And you are the thing that makes the difference. And that fundamental difference sometimes gets lost because now we have all of the tools of the movie world. We have all of the tools of the sound world. Game soundtracks are every bit as beautiful and artistically relevant and valuable as any type of music, as any type of scoring, as any type of audio endeavor. But because we have all of those assets available to us, it makes it easier to forget the central point, which is that interaction, which is that style of gameplay that differentiates you. The moment-to-moment feel of what it is to be a player, how it feels to move in the world, how it feels to do things, how it makes you feel that you're interacting with an environment or with other players in that environment. And I know everybody talks about this stuff all the time. But even though everybody talks about this stuff all the time, like so many games come out where that is completely lost, where that idea is totally lost. And it's difficult sometimes to figure a way through how you're going to address that, especially if you're in the middle of development, or you're dealing with a limited budget, which everybody is, and you're terrified of this, but you're super excited about your game, but things aren't working about it. It's very, very, very daunting. So what I'm suggesting is maybe go back to some old games, play some old games, familiarize yourself with the way that these very simple old games work. King's Quest, arcade games, the original Zelda. Very, very, very simple games. Look at them. Play them. Get your head in that space. Now, think of your game in that context. If you were to use the Zelda renderer, the original Zelda NES renderer, for your game, would your game be fun? How would you do it? And it may be totally irrelevant. Your game may not be possible in that engine, so you have to think of something else. I'm not saying that's a be-all, end-all. But if you simplify and refine your game idea back to that, is it still fun? Is it still something that you would play? And if not, what would you change? And I think in most cases, you're going to start learning about things that are going to help your big game for real in its full rendering glory or stylized glory or whatever it is, because you can go back to the to the very basics of what it is that you're doing. And in other disciplines, in certainly in music, in animation, even in physics, which is what I spend my days doing now, there are analogous processes of going back to the basics, making sure that the Earth is still round under your feet when your head is up in the clouds. And we can do it in games also. We can look at the past. We can learn from the past, not in a nostalgic way, but in a dynamic way, by imagining how those constraints that played into the beauty and the simple power of those concepts can be used for us today. All right, this is enough. You've had enough of the rantings of an old man. thank you very much for listening. We survived without a postman showing up. We survived without any dogs barking, and I consider it to be that, a great victory, which is enough for today. I hope the conference is going well. I wish I could be there with you, specifically so that I could have some excellent Italian food, but it's not going to be, so I'm going to go get a taco here in Pasadena.